So, welcome to everyone that's turned up. Well, as I was just saying, this is the first time that we've done anything like this, and it's all very exciting. And we're navigating the new socially distanced CAA, as I'm sure everyone is experiencing in their daily lives. I'd like to introduce the panel for this evening's talk. Tom Foggin is an associate at RHP and he's chair of RIBA East region. With Alice Hamlin, who's an architect at Mole. Patrick Osborne, also an associate at RHP and a member of the RIBA Sustainable Futures Group. And Louise McGarrigle, who is an architectural assistant also at Mole Architects. And I'm Rachel Branton. I'm an architect at Cab Griffith, and I'm new chair of the Cambridge Association of Architects. So just, I suppose, before I let the panel introduce themselves further and give a bit of an overview of their articles, I guess we should probably just have a little bit of housekeeping. You may see there is a question and answer panel. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, if you could type them into there, and I'll do my best to fish them out, and if possible if I can work out how to do it, allow people to talk, and then you can either ask your question, or if that doesn't work, then I'll read them out for you, and we can sort of get the discussion going that way. I think we're going to try and keep this to an hour maximum, but let's see how things go, and yeah, we can always revise for the next time. So with that, perhaps I'll turn to Tom to start off with. If you could just maybe give us a brief overview of the article that you've written. I mean, you'll have a good idea of all of the articles, being one of the editors of the journal, so that's why your first choice.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. So to be honest, the article I wrote was a final page appendix to Patrick's article more than anything, but sort of setting out the scene of the context of climate change in the RIBA Eastern region. So as region chair, I represent RIBA members across the region on the Nations and Regions Committee, and also sit on the East Region's Sustainability Group, which also includes Patrick actually, and a few other familiar names who I see in the participant panel. And what we've been trying to do at a regional level is work out how we can support RIBA members across the region with addressing the climate change issue. Obviously, there's been various publications released from Central RIBA, such as the Sustainable Outcomes Guide and the Climate Challenge 2030, and also some useful documentation about embodied carbon and other aspects along the way. But it's a question of whether or not all that information is getting out to members and is readily available. So we're looking at ways we can try and support members finding that information, but rather than just the cold facts of those reports, also supporting members with being able to lobby potentially clients and contractors, but also local authorities in advocating the need for change, the need to address this issue. So looking at whether we can develop perhaps illustrated case studies of projects that have worked well and projects that maybe haven't worked so well. So that's some of the things we're trying to think about at the moment. Obviously, things have all got a little bit knocked off kilter with the current situation in terms of social distancing. Priorities of RIBA in the past couple of weeks have been more on supporting members with this urgent issue short term, but we're sort of moving into the next phase of being able to go back to business as usual and get back to supporting members in the issues that are important to them. So that's kind of it really as a summary.
That's good, thank you. I realised that actually, yes, I should have introduced you the other way around. So just to clarify that, I suppose, slightly more, if we turn to Patrick now.
Sure, okay, so yeah, my article is a little bit of an intro to why this is important. We're into the defining decade. We've got 10 years to radically decarbonise our industry and and generally, it's so critical now to try and reduce carbon emissions to achieve, or at least to have a decent chance of keeping global temperatures rising by 1.5 degrees. So my article talked a little bit about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which not only talk about carbon, but also creating a more equitable, more sustainable, more positive world. What we, as the Sustainable Futures Group, did was take the goals from the UN publication and relate those to what we believe can be impacted by our industry, by construction. And from that came the RBA 2030 Climate Challenge, and that relates to three main metrics. It's looking at embodied carbon, it's looking at the energy in use, so that's the measured, the build energy, and also water consumption. There's a few other elements to it, but those are the key metrics that we are looking to try and to look at. What's really exciting is that there has been a lot of documentation, a lot of guidance come out in the last year or so from organisations like LETI that are defining what we mean by zero carbon or net zero, because I think it was always a bit of a misunderstanding or something that was a little bit woolly. But what's amazing now is that clients are now asking us to say what we think zero carbon is and to define it. And that's our job. We have to lead, because we're normally the consultants that are right in at the beginning. We need to be pushing forwards with this and taking the clients along with this journey. So that led into the local element that Tom added. But what's great is that there are local branches of the Architects Climate Action Network forming in Cambridge, and there are numbers of smaller groups locally that are trying to do this. We just need to link up with all the other local groups in different areas that are doing similar things, and create this amazing work that can be used by the whole industry.
Okay, thank you. And now perhaps Alice and Louise, you could paraphrase your article.
So myself and Alice co-authored the article, and it kind of set out to give resources and kind of actions that individuals and practices can kind of take going forward. So there was kind of two threads to the article, kind of office actions and how to also get involved in kind of wider discussions, which Alice is going to speak about. But I suppose we are trying to push calculating embodied carbon within the office, and kind of listed out how firms can do that, what programs we have found useful, and also how to kind of just talking about setting up schedules for carbon positive materials, and kind of how we've kind of got on in the office with that.
Yeah, and then the sort of second strand was about a wider conversation that we think is needed, because I think a lot of people, when they first really engage with the climate crisis, there's sort of different thoughts that come up, and as architects we obviously have a lot of control in our projects and an ability to really push targets forward, but then we are still within the constraints of, we all work for businesses that need to get projects in and need to sustain themselves. And none of us particularly want to lose our jobs. So, we're within a system that is forcing us to work in a certain way. So I think beyond what we can do in the office to minimise the impact of individual projects, there's a second strand, which is about figuring out collectively what a different kind of world might be like, and then figuring out how to help that happen. So We've been talking about this a bit within the CAA, and also we've got some links with ACAN, the Architects Climate Action Network in London, who have led on things like the Part L consultation and help supporting Letty with setting up consultation material to help us to respond more effectively and get our voices out there. So I suppose from this evening, what might be interesting, I think, speaking for myself, I don't have a huge amount of confidence to talk about what the answers are, but it's good to keep the conversation going and hear what other people's thoughts might be on wider campaigns we could be running to lead to bigger changes than just what we can do in our own practices.
So I think if I just, before I open up to questions from everyone, just one thing that has occurred to me through reading the articles is that it was interesting, Patrick, that you mentioned you have clients coming to you asking you how you define zero carbon, what that is, and whether that's going to align with their own aspirations, one would hope. And Alice, you mentioned about, obviously we're architects and we're all working for or running businesses that do have to survive, and it's kind of an interesting thing is how do you get clients, how do you convince a client who isn't necessarily already on board with achieving a net zero carbon or net zero embodied energy, how you can convince them that it is something that we really need to be doing, especially when it's something that they're perhaps going to have to pay more money for. Any thoughts on that? Perhaps Patrick, if we could go to you first.
Okay, yeah, that's it. It's the kind of the fundamental question, isn't it? It doesn't always. I'm sorry, that's my son. It doesn't always necessarily have to be more expensive. I don't think certain constraints can be opportunities. So certainly, if we tackle, if we're setting targets right at the beginning, the opportunities to create a more efficient form, that will certainly save money in the long run. I think it's just being honest and explaining to clients and taking them on this journey. We have to remember that I think something like 65–70% of local authorities have declared a climate emergency. So if you're working with one of these clients, then they've already made that commitment. With maybe other housing developers or other clients, maybe they're house owners that don't necessarily understand these issues, you can frame the argument in different ways. When we're looking at tackling in-use energy and in-use heating, we can talk about the improved health benefits, the improved comfort as well that they will be getting with a climate ready building. Okay.
Alice or Louise, perhaps you've got something to add to that. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's more talking from your own experience at Mole Architects, how you might persuade a client that these are worthy things. Or perhaps you've been really lucky and you always have clients that come to you with the right goals in mind.
I think on the whole, we target those kinds of clients and they come to us, so that makes it easier, but obviously that's not the case for every practice, and can't be the case for every practice. I suppose it comes down to each individual client. So we have some who perhaps have the budget but don't have the interest, so then maybe things like obviously legislation makes things a lot easier, and tougher planning policies make things a lot easier, because then if they have to do it, they will. And also things like awards, like I think there's a few clients that we could maybe persuade by saying, well, you want to have an award-winning building, and to do that you need to meet these targets, so that would be one that is going to be useful going forward. But it can be frustrating. So we have one client at the moment who has all the right ambitions and just has a tiny budget, so it's difficult to know how we're going to deal with it in that case.
I think we also have talked about maybe early doors setting up a letter that we send out, that kind of maybe sets out what standards we would meet for that project, and also the costs and budget implications that if we were to meet it, how that might affect the budget. So it's kind of clear from the beginning.
Okay, so that kind of follows on, and just looking at some of the questions that have come in. We've got a question from Ralph Carpenter, who's asking, who decides whether architects are actually achieving zero carbon in practice? So that's kind of an interesting thing. I might allow Ralph to talk, and he can perhaps elaborate on that point a little bit more. So Ralph, be prepared. I think your video will probably pop up too. There we go. Oh no, still muted. Oh dear, here we go. Ralph, are you there?
Yep.
Okay, would you like to perhaps elaborate slightly on your question about what, I mean?
My question is really to do with the consultation on the changes to Part L and the fact that many of us in this sector are deeply concerned that the government is actually pandering to developers and not really addressing climate change in a meaningful way. They're just bolting things on. And if you've been around as long as I have, you'll realize that regulation is the only way to get people to change. And Part L is the ideal opportunity to bring in regulation which requires people who are building buildings. And I'm not just saying developers, I'm talking about individuals, public sector clients, clients who maybe don't have an architect as a client advisor. There's a whole raft of people who need to be obliged to take action. Because as Patrick says, we've got 10 years, and many of our projects can take 5 to 8 years to come off the blocks. So unless that regulation is in place now, nothing's going to change.
Okay. Anything to add to that? Tom, perhaps you've been quite quiet.
I have been quiet. I've been keeping in the background. Yes is the answer. We do need to advocate for change, and it's something that I know I and the sustainability group in the East region are keen to push. What's fundamental is lobbying the national government to make changes to building regulations. Not just building regulations though, there's also the issue around retrofit having to pay VAT, and that instantly makes a project which could potentially save huge amounts of energy use in a building 20% more expensive. Why? That doesn't seem to make sense. So there's aspects, we need a holistic approach from the UK government to address this issue. And in terms of being able to, sort of going back to the previous question as well, explain why it's worthwhile doing this, illustrated examples are probably a good way to do it, to show the cost benefit or the comfort benefit of having a more controlled, better, more comfortable environment to live or work in. So yes, I agree with you, Ralph, basically.
Absolutely. So there's an architect in New York who never talks about passive house, never talks about the environmental credentials of his projects. He just talks about the benefits. It's more comfortable, lower energy bills, all the benefits, but doesn't mention the P word, which I think is a brilliant idea.
Get it in by stealth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's so one thing I was going to mention was that the RIBA awards in 2022, no project will be shortlisted without operational energy. So POE data has to be submitted, and then 2025 will be the deadline for submitting both the operational energy, the embodied carbon calculation, and the water consumption as well. So that's going to drive a number of clients, like Alice was saying. If you want an award, you will have to do this. But I get Ralph's point. It's going to be legislation that drives the majority of projects.
So that thing about having to submit post-occupancy evaluation data for awards, I mean, that's something that is often quite difficult to achieve. I mean, to get that information, I suppose it depends on the kind of project that you're doing, but if it's, for example, a private house, that's going to be a lot harder to assess, perhaps, depending on the clients, than a new public building for a council who are fully on board with the sort of net zero carbon emissions. I just wonder how that can be encouraged, but then perhaps that comes down to setting it out, when with the initial letter to welcome the clients and say these are the targets that we're going to achieve, and this is we want to make sure that we do achieve them. Perhaps that's the way that we need to do it. I don't know. I wonder, is that something that you do at RHP already, or is it something that you're looking to do?
It's obviously varied between projects. I think the requirements will be less onerous for smaller projects. So for a single house, energy bills would be adequate for that in-use calculation.
Okay.
And there are a number of other awards that already ask for this. So we're actually a little bit behind the curve on this. The CIBSE Building Performance Awards already ask for this, and the Passive House Trust Awards have asked for this for a number of years. So it's not necessarily going to be really difficult to do, I don't think.
Okay.
So for smaller projects, and hopefully larger projects, it will be either part of maybe a BREEAM assessment, will be specifying what POE is required. It will be tricky, but we have to change. We have to do this. Otherwise we won't meet our targets.
Well, yes, of course. Do Tom, Alice, or Louise, do you have anything to add to that, or should we move on to another question? I think
I've got something slightly controversial to say, in that potentially it's a two-way street as well, though. We're talking about, if there are award schemes and they ask for operational energy to prove that they work, well, we also have a duty of care to our clients to ensure that the buildings we're designing are actually meeting the targets that they need to meet. It comes down to that performance gap, which I think Alex has asked as a question. You're probably going to
that was going to be my next question.
Sorry, but it's about designing in a way that tries to rule out that performance gap, and perhaps we as architects need to be held to account if our buildings aren't meeting the standards we're saying they will.
Well, having made that point, I might just, Alex, I'm going to allow you to talk if you'd like to expand on your question about a gap between intent and performance in operation. If you're there. Alex? He's muted.
Mute, yeah.
Oh, technology. No, I can't unmute. Never mind. In that case, I will. Alex has made the point. He said there's often a gap between intent and performance in operation. And does the panel have any thoughts about how that gap can be closed? And Tom, you've kind of already pointed out that it is something that we do need to work on. Alison or Louise, have you got any thoughts on that? Or indeed anyone else that wants to chip in from the attendees? I think if you raise your hand, I'm not quite sure how you do that, but I know you can do that, then I can allow you, it'll pop up and it'll, I can let you talk. Ralph has raised his hand. Ralph, you're back. And Alex, I thought I heard you there. Ralph, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, I do. Several years ago, I was in America, and I remember reading in one of the local papers that in one of the states where these things are already being implemented. They were giving tax breaks to companies if they achieved energy performance improvements, but they were taking the tax breaks away if, when they came to measure their performance, they weren't meeting what they said they would meet. And I think that's a really brilliant way of incentivizing people, because we all know that money counts. And ultimately, if you give people tax breaks on the basis that they're going to hit zero carbon and then take them away if they don't, I think it would transform the way people think about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suspect we might need, well, a change in government perhaps for such things do take place, but we can.
Yeah, and another measure we've talked about a bit in the office that would be great if it came out of the Part L consultation, however likely that might be, is that probably the biggest legislative change that would help with build quality would be just to increase the air tightness requirements, because to achieve high air tightness, then you need to build it right from the start. So the thinking is that if you set that at sort of like 3 instead of 10 as it is at the moment, that might be one measure that would force a lot more supervision on site and a lot more care in sort of standard house building sites. So that might be a good outcome if the Part L does increase the requirements for that.
I was just seeing in the question and answers, Margaret Reynolds, who I'm about to allow to talk, so be prepared, has made the point that sustainability shouldn't be an option at master's level, and we need to needs to be something that starts right from university. Margaret, have you anything further to add to that?
No, I think we all know that a lot of the things we learned when we were at college, we've had to do a lot more work and research to get up to speed on this. And it really, there is an excuse now not to have people teaching beginning architects right from the start how to do this, so that it's sort of built in, if you like, to the profession. And these people, the younger ones, will have a different point of view even, but it's critical to have the people coming into the profession really up and running on this. And I just think I don't know how we do that. I don't know how you get the course syllabus changed, or the people teaching, should be updating all the time and using, I don't know, case studies, whatever, but I think it's critically important.
So there is talk about reviewing the RBA requirements for part 1, 2 and 3, and we are consulting on that. So the Sustainable Futures Group is inputting into that. I don't know how far that will go. Yeah. So I don't know if it will be as radical as it needs to be. Just understanding the metrics within the climate guide will be a minimum, I think. And there are still Part 2 students that I've taught that don't know these things, that don't know how to design to these levels. So it's critical that the people that are qualifying now know these things.
I think it's interesting. Again, in the US, it varies from state to state, but there's something called Passive House Massachusetts, which now has access to utility company money, a bit like the way we had FITs, feed-in tariffs, and they simply tap that to pay architects to train in Passive House and builders to train in Passive House, and they have been so successful. They've only applied it to multi-story, multi-family apartment buildings, which makes a lot of sense. And they have about 60 projects that are being funded at each step of the way. You do a design, and then you're given free or a large budget to have it done as a passive house feasibility. And so you're bringing people on at all levels, and that admittedly, that's not training in the colleges, you know, at beginning level, but the state can do that in some places.
I'm just going to bring in Delyth Turner-Harriss, because she's made a point about the RIBA has just changed its validation requirements and perhaps might wish to expand on it. Of course, you don't have to if you don't want. I realise I'm not giving people a choice whether they want to talk or not. I'm just making them. But Delyth, perhaps that's something you might wish to expand on?
Hi, I just thought I'd make the point because I was listening to David Gloucester talk to people at university level this week, and he was saying that there had been changes. So if you wanted to retain your validation or be a validated university, then they wanted to look much more at climate change and recognise that. So they're going to start in 2020, but it will be obligatory by 2021.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I don't know what the rest of the panels remembers from being at university, but I certainly remember there was a kind of interesting juxtaposition between the technical requirements and the design requirements of the course, and they definitely seem to be, or at least in my university, they seem to be run separately and not necessarily interlink or even take account of each other's deadlines. And you know, they were that separate. And I do wonder whether, perhaps going slightly off topic, but I do wonder whether when there is more of an overhaul of the architectural education required. But perhaps that's a discussion for another day. I don't know.
It's interesting. So I saw a talk last year saying that there's about 500 passive house designers in the UK, and not all of those are architects. We've got about 40,000 registered architects practicing. So, you know, that's one issue. We could get way more passive house designers. That would be a simple thing. But then we don't have the builders either. We don't have the builders that know how to do this. So there are other training courses similar to what Margaret is talking about, where contractors can go on training courses. They spend 2 days learning how to tape and make airtight projects, basically. So it's another thing that I think needs to be encouraged. You know, when we're getting tenders back, you know, have these contractors either done this or can prove that they can do it.
Although it is quite difficult to prove that you can do something that you've not done before, so you do have to. You've got to make sure that people still get a chance to have a go, I suppose.
Well, yeah, maybe.
You know, otherwise you end up with a monopoly of a few builders. But that's again.
Well, that's kind of what we have. So in London, there are very few builders that have done this, and so there's one company that I've worked with, and they are just doing almost all of the small scale passive house retrofits and new build. And they are just completely overrun. And there's a real gap in the market. You know, you can flip it on its head and say this is an opportunity.
Edward Lay has says he completely agrees with Margaret. I've just allowed him to talk if he wishes to, but if not, he said, I completely agree with Margaret. This should be a top priority. Just completed a master's in transport, and sustainability was a very minor element of the course for the tiny minority specialising in environment and sustainability. It should, of course, be a golden thread running through every single architecture, civil engineering, building and other practical construction course. So it seems everyone's on the same page with that, really.
I know this is one of the topics that ACAN in London is looking at, and at the moment they are doing a lot of their meetings via Zoom, obviously. So it's quite a good time if anyone is interested in getting involved with campaigns to see what they're up to. And then obviously if there's anything that people want to set up, then the CAA are very happy to help with that. And the other interesting project is there's a guy called Scott McCauley who has pretty much single-handedly set up a thing called the Anthropocene Architecture School, And he started out in Glasgow, but he's kind of spread because there's been a lot of demand for his courses. And he's developed, I think it's a half-day climate literacy course that he's been delivering to a lot of students, because there was a sense that this is something that is definitely lacking in architecture schools. So I know that they are campaigning for with trying to work with architecture schools, and also there are courses going on. So yeah, if anyone's interested, then those would be things to look up and find out more about.
Okay, that sounds good. Perhaps we should move on to a different question. I see Susie Lober has asked on a slightly different topic. Are the panel aware of any initiatives in Cambridgeshire to bring derelict and empty buildings back into use? Tom, are you aware of any any initiatives in Cambridgeshire?
Simple answer, no. I'm not aware of any. Is anybody else?
Or indeed any of our attendees, please raise your hand if you know something, because I'd really like to know. I'm not aware, however, it was part of the part of my motivation for getting more involved with CAA, is that I think it's something I've noticed in recent years. There are more and more empty shops in the city centre, and I know in other cities, Leeds, for example, there was an initiative to rent out for very cheap rent, so disused office buildings on very short-term leases for people who wish to use them for art studios, and it was sort of on the understanding that it was going to be very short-term, and there were certain types of art that you could do in certain studios depending on what was appropriate. And I think that's something that would be really, really interesting to see if would work in Cambridge. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of struggling artists that can't possibly afford their own studio around here. So no, I'm not aware of anything. However, I would like to see whether that could gain some momentum as an idea. Anyone else got anything to add, or shall I look for another question? Seems to be Mark Richards has said councils are supposed to hold brownfield site registers, but the registers that he's seen are a register of completed schemes, rather than brownfield sites, presumably brownfield sites that are available for development. I don't really have anything to say on that. I wonder if we've got any representation from the council here that might wish to comment on that. If anyone's got any other questions, please type in, and if not, I'm going to turn to some that we had prepared earlier. So the RIBA 2030 guidance, the climate challenge sets out targets for new construction very clearly, but then there's also a big focus on retrofitting. That's what we ought to be doing. So what do we think about targets for energy efficiency and retrofitting? What are the RIBA perhaps doing about that? Patrick, I'm going to turn to you.
Sure. So yeah, the idea with the 2030 climate challenge is that it's split into the domestic and non-domestic new build sectors, with the caveat that we should be retaining buildings where possible. The guidance is that we should be, if we have the opportunity to deep retrofit projects, they should be using the same targets, which will be really tricky to do. They're challenging enough for new build, but it's what we should be targeting. We have something like 30 million existing buildings. They are the vast majority of our carbon emissions from buildings come from from what we have already in our stock. So we need to deal with those pretty quickly. There will be more guidance in the future. So in the next year or so, the RBA and Letty are working on a new guidance document on retrofit. So hopefully that will be published either kind of September, October, November time. We're not really sure quite when. The kickoff meeting was last week, so hopefully we'll have a bit more information fairly soon on what we need to do. But it's such a tricky subject, because there are so many different types of building, so many different uses. You can't apply one rule to all of them, so it needs to be a considered approach. There's guidance in PAS 2035, which is it sets up the role of a retrofit coordinator, and this was developed the concept was developed a few years ago from an idea developed by the RBA and taken forwards. And the idea is that you have someone involved in a project that can have the overview from the initial design all the way through to completion. And that to me sounds like the role that we should be doing. Architects get involved at the start, and they should be going all the way through to the end and monitoring what is happening on site. At least that's the kind of the traditional role, and it's what we really need to be doing. So yeah, past 2035, that is still scheduled to be required for publicly funded retrofit projects by 2021. So January 2021, they'll have to be run under that guidance. So that's something that will be something that pushes that forwards. But certainly the Letty guide will be stating a bit more information about how we tackle these projects.
Okay, so we don't know yet, but we will.
Basically, yeah.
I suppose just looking through the chat, relating back to the brownfield sites, Nick Kendall has said he can ask, but he doesn't know the answer about brownfield sites. But that's Nick of 3C Shared Services. So perhaps he will know, or we'll be able to get to the right person in the council to find out, presumably.
I think Margaret's point about raising airtightness requirements is incredibly important, particularly for retrofit, but for new build as well. You know, if we're increasing the airtightness, we need to couple that with ventilation. Needs to be considered properly.
Margaret, I've just allowed you to talk if you wish to add anything to that. And while you do, if you want to, we've got a poll set up about the RIB 2030 Climate Challenge. I'm going to launch that and see what happens. You may, somewhere, you'll be able to vote on this, which might perhaps trigger some further discussion. There's just two questions, which are you aware of the 2030 Climate Challenge, and do you or your organisation have the skills necessary to fully address climate change issues? So while everyone else is looking at that, Margaret, did you want to add something else? Sorry.
Just to say, I mean, I think we all know that if you change the air movement behavior in a building, you have to then rejig the ventilation, so the air tightness and ventilation go together. Build tight air, build right. And the retrofit coordinator role puts risk at the very top of what they talk about with the clients right at the start, and air tightness is one of the high risk things. So it's all coming through now, but we don't want anybody in building regs to separate those two and have airtight houses where they haven't improved the ventilation, or we'll be back to square one.
Absolutely, that's really critical, and basic things like changing windows and adding external wall insulation can change the airtightness of a building.
Yep.
So it's understanding those things as well that's it's yeah, it's risk.
So Anthony Cooper has said, I think retrofit is going to be almost impossible given the range of the quality of housing stock. Zero carbon is the magic bullet here. Anthony, if you want to add anything else, now is your opportunity. Or not, don't feel that you have to. So looking at the poll, 65% of people have voted, so 21 people have voted. 71% of people are aware of the RIBA 2030 climate challenge. But actually, no one said they've never heard of it, which is good. The other 30% have said they've heard of it but don't know any details, which is interesting. And it's about, well, it's a third, whether the organisation have the skills necessary to address the issue. Yes, a third of people say yes they do, a third say no but we're training, and a third say no but we intend to learn more. I wonder whether that's something, if it's, admittedly this is a very small sample size, but if a third of this very small sample have said that they, although they've heard of the 2030 climate challenge and don't know any further details, whether that's something that the RIBA, perhaps at a local level, need to do more to address. Tom, what do you think to that?
Absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head there. Part of the challenge is that information is being produced by the RIBA, by LETI, by ACAN, but it's actually helping people find that information and then be able to digest it. I mean, you know, the climate challenge document itself is only about 8 pages, but the sustainable outcomes guide that goes with that is then something like 60 pages. And, you know, when you're running several projects, you've got, you know, invoices to get out, clients to answer. Do you have time to sit down and read a 60-page document? Is there a way we could support people be able to absorb that information in other ways, or perhaps just run workshops, discussions like this to talk through some of the key themes? I think at local level, particularly branch level, that's really where we could have some impact.
Maybe that's something that we CAA should really discuss further. Mark Richards has written a question. What does architecture after architecture look like? A question posed by Jeremy Till recently in the AF 100-day series. I don't quite know what you mean by that, Mark. Perhaps you could explain.
Well, it touches a little bit on the other question about education in architecture. Mm-hmm. And we've all gone through the education sort of process, those of us that are architects that are listening in, and it hasn't changed for probably over 60 years. Mm. And now we're facing a completely different sort of challenge, really, where a lot of the old formulations of architecture don't really cut the mustard, to be honest, when it comes to actually putting buildings together. And particularly seamless architects are really only responsible really for sort of 10% of buildings that are actually constructed, 90% being by others, obviously. What does, you know, architecture with a small c, what does it look like after sort of architecture with a capital A that we've all been taught over the last sort of 50, 60 years?
Mark, what are your thoughts on the new, newish architectural apprenticeships?
Well, I think there's a big problem at the moment, really, because sustainability, which is also from the same similar sort of discussions, really, suggests that it's a continuation of the norm. So everybody continues to pick away at the sort of the detail, if you like, when actually there are much bigger issues at play, which will determine whether we meet, you know, low carbon, low energy outcomes or not. So unless you have the right tools to be able to teach and demonstrate those, I mean, that's one of the areas I struggle with, and as a small practice, is actually finding the right tools to give me to actually demonstrate to clients that, you know, if you make a comparison, there are no sort of say, for example, if you had a pattern book, for example, of simple buildings, let's just take residential, for example, you had a pattern book of types of buildings that you can make a comparison with. And so you can make an equal comparison with in terms of its carbon use, in terms of materials, etc., but also in terms of energy performance. Obviously, because it's an engineered solution, it's going to come down to sort of the maths and the science of the block. So if you make a reasonable volume, just like in Passive House, you can trick Passive House by actually creating quite a large volume, very efficient space, say a cube, and put lots of things inside it. And the bigger the cube becomes, the easier the maths become to make that building work. So I think it's having those demonstrable sort of patterns to basically start the groundwork with, because architects are very good at actually changing the rules and coming up with alternative solutions. And I think that's where, if we're not careful, we're actually going to end up right on the back foot, because the people with all of those aspects to hand are the manufacturing companies, the modular builders, for example, the manufacturers of products. They know exactly how much carbon is in their particular material, for example. Whereas we're struggling to find out, if you go onto the ICE website, for example, and try and find the data just to try and assemble a very crude volumetric study of carbon that you create in your building, it's quite difficult. It's very time consuming. So I don't think we've really got the tools to hand as much as we do have the tools to hand to demonstrate how something looks, for example, as architects.
So really then we need to get manufacturers on board.
Well, I think there are a lot of EPDs now available, so environmental product declarations. I think possibly, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but the bigger problem is the time it takes to dig those out and then apply them to your projects. And I think this is possibly something that affects smaller practices more than larger ones, because larger practices are generally using tools like Revit, which already have, so there's Hawkins-Brown's calculator HBERT that is a plugin for Revit, or are more likely to have things like PHPP, which you can use the PH ribbon with. So there are tools available, but it's finding the one that works for your practice and that you can afford, and that you can also afford to put the time in to do the calculations. And that's definitely something that's tricky. But yeah, I think that's something we've been struggling with at Mole. I think we have now found the answer that works for us. I think we're going to use the PH ribbon. So it is worth checking out which other software tools there are already, and there are more emerging, and that might get easier over time. But I think the time issue of how long it takes to do within a project is a tricky one when you're working on a small one-off job where there isn't the fee to then spend ages learning how to use all this extra stuff.
Which, of course, once you've invested the time in it, initially, it's there for all of your future projects, or at least all of your future projects of a similar typology, perhaps.
Absolutely, I think that's what Archetype have done with a number of their schools. They've used exactly the same construction type, so it's just they almost have a pattern book for schools, so they can then use that construction. They know what's within that build up, so they know the carbon within that project, and they just then apply it to a new scheme.
But is that another thing that the CAA can help with in terms of, like, I know Patrick, you've been doing a lot of great work with the AECB meetings of having these kinds of conversations in a sort of kind of quite casual project by project, just offering help. That's possibly something that we can do. So,
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. So it's almost like a workshop, where we could talk about something specific and come up with solutions. Yeah.
Sounds good. Kind of hard to do over Zoom, but yeah.
Yeah. Now, with an eye on the time, does anyone have any final questions that could be answered very quickly, or anyone on the panel have any final points that they'd like to make?
Can I just ask, is there a way we can collect up the questions that haven't been answered and either save them for another time or find a way of answering them? I don't know how it works when we close down.
I don't know, but I'm sure we can figure it out.
We will find out.
Okay, I think, Tom?
So I was just going to say, I think Margaret Reynolds made a really good point in the Q&A that talking about things like passive house, that's, you know, extreme, going to that scientific level of the full passive house standards, but it's about instilling the principles, particularly in education, of the next generation of architects, is that we all have to be working towards better use of carbon, well, less use of carbon, better use of energy, more efficient building forms. And whether or not it achieves you know, you put the plaque on the wall because it's a passive house scheme or not, if you've managed to reduce your energy consumption, your carbon footprint, you've done a great job. I guess we're all probably of like mind, but yeah, we don't always have to have it's a pass or fail. It's about working towards that goal, I guess.
Yeah, I think if it's a pass or fail thing, then it's quite easy to become unmotivated if you think you're doing really well and then you fail right at the final hurdle. Whereas in actual fact, perhaps all of the effort that you've put into making something, you know, is worthwhile because it's all something that you can learn from, I think. Okay, interesting. Perhaps we should wrap up for this evening, and we will probably be doing this again on a slightly different topic. I'm not sure when yet. I think I'd quite like to work out how we can make it more interactive and get more people talking, yet still maintain a little bit of control. So perhaps we'll figure out that for next time, so it can be more of a back and forth between a larger number of people. But thank you all for attending. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you all on the panel for giving up your very busy social lives out and about. And yeah, we'll hopefully see some of you all again next time we do this. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.